Chapter 15. Here we go. Mrs. Bennet did not take the news that Charlotte was engaged to Mr. Collins mildly. She spent days in denial, telling herself and anyone who would listen how ridiculous of a rumor it was. When it was confirmed by Sir William Lucas himself, she decided that Charlotte must have tricked Mr. Collins into marrying her. After she exhausted her musings on that position, she moved on to proclaiming they would never be happy together, and that there was, of course, the possibility that the engagement would be broken off. No matter how changeable her feelings on the subject were, Mrs. Bennet did not waver on her belief that the entire situation was Elizabeth's fault. If she had simply agreed to marry him when he asked her, none of this would have happened. The estate of her husband would remain in her family and not in the greedy clutches of the eldest spawn of Lucas Lodge. When Mr. Collins returned to Longbourn 2 weeks later, it was no great surprise that his arrival did not improve Mrs. Bennet's mood. On the contrary, each time they were in a room together, she sulked until he left it. She did not have to suffer his presence often, however. He spent most of his time at Lucas Lodge, leaving early in the morning and not returning until just before the family went to bed. Poor Charlotte had suddenly found herself ill at ease at Longbourn. She and Elizabeth had little opportunity to speak without Collins observing them closely, and spent much of their time together in uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Bennet threw daggers at Charlotte with her eyes whenever she came for dinner, imagining her to be reveling in the anticipation of one day calling the house her own. Everyone seemed to be relieved when the week was over and Collins was to leave once more. Everyone except Collins himself, that is, whose joy would not be complete until his return to claim his bride. After giving his typical long-winded farewell speech, he finally set off for Hunsford. Mrs. Bennet then went through the entire house, opening windows to air out the stench of marked territory she felt in every room. Elizabeth and Jane had made themselves scarce while Collins visited, as they had absolutely no desire to be drafted into their mother's surreptitious war on himself and Charlotte. Since Mrs. Bennet spent the morning after Collins left in a particularly irritable mood, they decided to walk to Meryton to visit Mr. Wickham. It was the first time the two of them had been alone together since Caroline's letter, and as they walked in silence, Elizabeth realized how much she missed her sister's companionship. She gave her a tentative look. "Are you okay, Jane?" Jane smiled. "I am in excellent spirits now that our disagreeable guest has gone. It's just that we haven't spoken much since the letter you received from Netherfield. It seemed to upset you quite a bit. I will miss the friendship of Caroline Bingley. That is all." Elizabeth wanted to argue, but decided it would be best to remain silent. There was no way anyone could have kind feelings for Caroline Bingley. Even at her best, she was still always playing a game of cat and mouse. Jane glanced at her and, seeing her expression, added quickly, "I am well, Lizzie, I assure you. Any affection I felt for their party could never have amounted to more than that of an acquaintance anyway. Soon they will all just be a memory. I will find a way to forgo Caroline's friendship. Please, let us not speak of this again, for both our sakes. I know you must also be feeling the loss of Caroline. She thinks I miss Mr. Darcy." Jane stopped walking and took Elizabeth's hand in hers. "Truly, Lizzie, I only wish for everything to be as it was before. I have missed your companionship exceedingly. You are my dearest sister, after all." She gave her a hug and they resumed their walk. They spent the entire afternoon with Mr. Wickham and one of his comrades. Elizabeth felt herself becoming more and more unreserved with him in a way she had never been with Brian. She guessed it was because, in reality, she had never really known him. He had concealed who he was the entire time they were together because he wasn't certain she would accept him otherwise. But then again, hadn't Elizabeth done the same thing with Brian? Hadn't she attempted to look and act flawless in front of him? To appear as perfect as she perceived him to be? Now that there were no secrets or misguided emotions between them, they could just be themselves and be friends. Elizabeth felt the deep irony of the situation. It took a life-threatening accident and a subconscious delusion for her to finally have the relationship with Brian she wanted right from the start. Minus the being in love part, of course. Now that she had experienced it firsthand with Mr. Bingley, she realized her love for Brian, and now Mr. Wickham, was more platonic in nature than romantic from the start. In fact, Mr. Wickham was quickly becoming one of the best friends Elizabeth ever had. Really, he had always been the best friend she ever had. She just never realized it because she was too busy forcing a physical intimacy that would never exist. At least not for him. She still couldn't help thinking how extremely attractive he was, especially now that he wore that uniform every time she saw him. Saturday arrived, and with it came the arrival of Mrs. Bennet's brother and sister. Mrs. Bennet's brother and his wife for a visit. Elizabeth remembered them from the novel as Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. She was getting so used to seeing the characters as people from her own life that she wondered who they would appear as. When they stepped out of the carriage, Elizabeth was ecstatic to see that it was her very own Aunt Bridget walking toward her with a huge smile on her face. She hugged her tightly before she was practically pushed aside by her mother, who wasted no time unloading her burdens upon her sister-in-law of the two near marriages of their daughters. I do not blame Jane, for I have every reason to believe she would have accepted Mr. Bingley. After all, he did come in person to ask her for the first 2 dances at his own ball. The first 2. Imagine that. However, this business with Lizzie and Mr. Collins has been an extremely grievous affair. She could have been married to him by this time if it were not for her stubborn pride. He made her an offer, and she had the bad sense to refuse him. Now I must suffer the indignity of Lady Lucas lording it over me that she will have a daughter married and settled before me, and the added insult that she should be the recipient of my husband's estate instead of one of my own daughters. My only comfort at this most perilous time in my life is your coming, dear sister, and your news of long sleeves becoming the latest fashion. Mrs. Gardiner listened kindly, but for the sake of her nieces, changed the subject within minutes. Not surprisingly, she doted on Jane and Elizabeth in particular. Elizabeth felt as comfortable around her as if she really was her Aunt Bridget. Her outgoing personality made everyone at Longbourn feel relaxed and happy, which was not an easy feat after the recent string of events. After spending the morning filling Mrs. Bennet in on all the news from London, Aunt Gardiner found Elizabeth alone in her bedroom. Lizzie, do you find Jane as melancholy over Mr. Bingley's departure as I? She does seem heartbroken, does she not? It seems that it would have been a very desirable match for her. It is a shame that it did not work out. But then again, it had only been a matter of weeks that he was even at Netherfield. Surely he could not have been so much in love with her if some little accident could separate them and lead him to forget about her. It must have been only an inclination on his part. These sort of things happen all the time, you know. Elizabeth's heart began to beat faster as she contemplated how to reply. She took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. She is heartbroken. I really do think she was in love with him, but I think she would rather keep her feelings private. She hasn't even spoken to me about them. She gave her aunt a quick sideways glance. Do you really think it was too short of a time for him to fall in love with her? I suppose it is possible. What evidence was there to suggest his affection was more than a passing inclination? You mean besides the fact that he asked me to marry him? Well, Elizabeth thought aloud, trying to remember the reasons why she previously thought Mr. Bingley was in love with her sister, the reasons why Jane would have fallen in love with him. He danced with her at 2 different balls. They spent a lot of time talking together at Netherfield, when I was too sick to leave my room. Without confessing that they were characters in a novel that ended up together, she realized her evidence sounded kind of lame. Why exactly is Jane in love with Mr. Bingley? I'm sure she has spent more time talking to Mr. Darcy. The look on her aunt's face suggested Elizabeth wasn't the only one who thought the signs were weak. Mrs. Gardner smiled. Well, time heals all hurts. Jane will forget him, although with her sensitive disposition, it may take longer than, say, you, for example, Lizzie. Your humor and capricious nature always served you well in matters with men. You would have simply laughed yourself out of it, would you not? Elizabeth felt a lump in her throat. She forced a smile as she muttered, Yeah, good thing it wasn't me. She swallowed hard and fought back the tears that were stinging in her eyes. Mrs. Gardner cast her an inquisitive gaze. She opened her mouth to speak, but Elizabeth interrupted her. Maybe Jane could go back with you when you leave for London. I know she could use a change of scenery. She could use some time away from our mother, too. All she does is ask her when he is coming back to Netherfield. Her aunt smiled broadly. Yes, that is just the thing for Jane. We would be delighted to have her with us. Do you really believe she would come? I really do. The week Mr. and Mrs. Gardner spent at Longbourn passed very quickly due to the many social gatherings Mrs. Bennet arranged for them. The officers in Meryton were always invited to attend, and Mr. Wickham was continually among them, much to the delight of Elizabeth. They had the chance to talk almost every day, and spent most of their time together laughing. He quickly charmed his way into the heart of her aunt, who had spent a great deal of time in Derbyshire. She had known Mr. Darcy's father before he died, as well as several other mutual acquaintances of Mr. Wickham's. The two of them shared several hours of happy reminiscences. That's a hard one. And she found Wickham to be a delightful young man, despite his lack of status and fortune. Mrs. Gardner also observed the way he was with Elizabeth, and it wasn't long before she became convinced the two of them were very much in love. She felt it was therefore her responsibility to give her niece advice on the subject. As soon as she found herself alone with Elizabeth, she led off with, Would you mind very much, Lizzie, if I were to speak openly with you on a personal matter? Elizabeth felt her insides seize up with fear. Could she somehow have found out the truth about Mr. Bingley? She waited, terrified, for her to continue. I have been noticing something about you lately. You appear to be, well, there really is only one way to say it. In love. Elizabeth froze. She did know. What makes you say that? Oh, mostly the way you behave around him, her aunt replied. And I believe, from what I have seen, the affection is mutual. Now Elizabeth was very confused. Wait, who exactly are you referring to? Mr. Wickham, of course. He is obviously besotted with you. I have never seen a man more so. The way he pretends to find feminine topics of conversation interesting. Her aunt thought Mr. Wickham was in love with her. Elizabeth could have laughed out loud in relief. It took a full minute for her to mentally compose herself. Reading is not just a feminine topic of conversation, you know. Lizzie, I promise you, my dear aunt, Mr. Wickham is not in love with me, Elizabeth stressed, and I am not in love with him. I am definitely not in love with him. Mrs. Gardner gave her a knowing look. You must believe me, Lizzie, when I say that he is a charming young man, and exceedingly handsome. If his fortune were what it ought to be, I would tell you that you could do no better. But you must think of your poor father. You would not want to disappoint him after all. Believe me when I say that I am not in love with him. He is just a good friend, honestly. And he feels the same way about me. It's just that up until recently, I hadn't seen him for a long time. And now we have a chance to get reacquainted. That's all, Elizabeth assured her. I am glad of it. If he truly is merely a confidant, he can only be a credit to your character. He is polite, charming, and more than amiable. You are fortunate to have someone like that in your life. Elizabeth smiled. I really am. I just wish I had known that a long time ago. Mr. and Mrs. Gardner left with Jane for London later that day, and in their place Mr. Collins returned, although this time he opted to stay at Lucas Lodge with his future in-laws. The day before the wedding, Charlotte came to Longbourn to say goodbye. Elizabeth had mixed feelings on her departure. On one hand, she knew she would miss her friendship. On the other, she was finding it difficult to maintain eye contact now that her friendship came with Mr. Collins attached. She still managed to give her a genuine hug, however, and wish her all the best as she was getting ready to leave. "You will write to me often, dearest Lizzie." Elizabeth, who had not corresponded by any method except texts and emails since middle school, nodded. "Sure." Charlotte paused, her eyes welling with tears. "I have one more favor to ask of you. Would you come visit me in Hunsford?" "I'm sure you will be back soon to visit your family, won't you?" "I'll just wait until then." Charlotte's tears brimmed over onto her cheeks. "I have little hope of returning for some time. Please promise me you will come to Hunsford." "Of course I will, Charlotte," Elizabeth promised. She watched her walk away sadly down the lane back to Lucas Lodge. It's not like I have anything better to do. A few days after Jane's departure from Longbourn, Elizabeth began to deeply feel her absence. The nights were quickly becoming a source of dread. There was no one to talk to, no one whose reassuring presence besides her eliminated the few terrifying seconds when she woke up suddenly in the unbearable darkness, imagining the worst had happened. She was completely alone, with nothing but her depressing thoughts for company. The days were not much better, with her mother and sister's antics driving her to sneak wine from the kitchen. Elizabeth was therefore thrilled to receive a letter from Jane in London, that is, until she read it in its entirety. It was obvious that Jane was extremely unhappy. She had written a letter to Caroline Bingley to see if she could pay her a visit at her London home. Caroline's reply was overflowing with ecstasy at the chance to see her friend again. However, when Jane arrived, she was cool and distant toward her the entire visit. It was as if Jane had done something to offend her, but had absolutely no idea what it could be. The letter continued with the brief conversation Jane had with Caroline. She had asked about Mr. Bingley. Elizabeth had felt a sharp stab of pain when she read his name. But Caroline said that since he had his own house in London, she hardly ever saw him. Apparently, he was spending much of his time with Mr. Darcy, and the two of them were often gone for lengthy periods. The awkward meeting came to an end when Caroline informed Jane that she was expecting Miss Georgiana Darcy to dinner. It was mortifyingly clear she had no intention whatsoever of asking Jane to stay and join them. On her way out the door, Jane had to endure Caroline's repeated provocations that Georgiana Darcy would soon become a member of the Bingley family. It only made sense, of course, considering the two families were so intricately connected, and Georgiana was her brother's match in rank and fortune. It made as much sense as Caroline joining the Darcy family by marrying her future sister-in-law's older brother. Jane wondered if the two men involved in Caroline's plotting had any notion their futures were being decided for them over tea and biscuits. She left believing the afternoon was not the only amount of time she had wasted on Caroline Bingley. Elizabeth wiped away a tear as she folded up the letter. She felt terrible for her sister, who must have considered Caroline's words to be salt in an open wound. Were they just her usual amount of horse manure? Or was it possible there was truth mixed in? Not that she believed Mr. Bingley would ever voluntarily marry Georgiana Darcy, but what if in his grief he let Caroline convince him it was his duty, both as a gentleman and a friend to Mr. Darcy? If Georgiana really was the snake Mr. Wickham described her as, poor Mr. Bingley would have no idea what he was getting himself into. And yet, there was nothing Elizabeth could do about it. She had made her choice. Elizabeth put the letter away and turned her attention to another one. Charlotte had written to inform her she was now settled in her new home in Hunsford. She met Lady Catherine, who, based on her description, was every bit as wonderful as Mr. Collins proclaimed her to be. After a detailed narration of an evening spent at Rosings, she reminded Elizabeth of her promise to visit her. Her father and sister were to come in a week, and if it were not too much trouble, could she possibly join them? Elizabeth picked up the quill from its stand and dipped it in the inkwell. Before she even touched it to the paper, the ink dripped from the end, and Elizabeth watched in frustration as an enormous black spot stretched across the entire page. She crumpled it up, then grimaced as she noticed her fingers were now black. She instinctively wiped a piece of air away from her forehead and smeared ink across it. This should be fun.